Thank you, Christian, for your presentation. That helped us to think beyond our concept theories and fieldworks. So while we are heading to the round of questions, may I ask you to go back to one of the map? As a geographer, I'm quite obsessed by that. Sorry for that. Yeah. You can go back to the Kolkata one, which talked to me the most, at least maybe to all of us. How do you want to proceed? Do you want to take question by question or the round of?
I think maybe we have some questions.
Yeah. Okay. So we have one question. One, two. Okay. Wait. Yeah. Please talk in the mic, so as everyone can hear you.
Thank you for that very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask, like, talking about binaries, when we, in the urban literature, like, the global south is related to informality and chaos, and, the more developed world is more formal and more organized. But there is a range of informality in that part of the world as well. Like, what did you look at that at all?
Yes, we looked at that, yes.
So, notwithstanding that all of this comparative work has helped to bring new terms to the table, of the two types of urbanism that you described, people have used other kinds of terminologies to sort of say similar things. But my question is, how do we hope to influence planners or architects to think differently by coming up with new lexicons? Because we've been using whatever terms you're using for years, and there's still a very, very strong divide between people who see things in very specific ways and sort of still seek to impose those specific ways on these sort of self-built or, autonomously emerging forms of urbanism. So really my question is, does the lexicon change the way we think?
Last question. Can I request you to present yourself shortly, very briefly?
Yes. So my name is Olga Sippin, and I work as international consultant on sustainable urban development in Asian cities. Thank you very much for this presentation, which was very insightful and brought, in fact, new terms which generate new thinking. Now what I see, you're not questioning so much the process of urbanization per se. According to some studies, for example, UNDP has been doing some studies, it shows that because of the new technologies that have come massively, the work market is changing significantly. So in some countries, the projections are that in 20 to 50 years, maybe 80% of the jobs we have right now are not going to exist. And that includes also Asian developing countries. So now that this process happens, there is a likelihood that with the job market shift, the urbanization process may shift as well. We already see it partially in, I was doing an assessment of medium-sized cities in Thailand, where people more and more want actually to settle outside of the city and come occasionally to use the services, but they feel they're much better off with greenery and better spaces and so on. So, have you done any assessments or projections on what could future cities be with the possibility to work from home with different technologies and the change of job markets in the medium long term?
Okay, these are three very different questions. So first about informality. The question of informality, yes, I mean, it was clear that informality was seen as the, let's say, the characteristics of cities in the global south. Now, as you have seen, we first of all, I mean, informality. What is informality? It is a way of territorial regulation. No, it is not. So there is a material process. There is an everyday life, and there is informality that somehow regulates the way how houses are constructed, or if you make it in a let's say in a wider context, also how jobs, for instance, are organized. But also, if you go to the, let's say, to the question of jobs, it is always about regulation processes. Now, so it is just one aspect beneath others, and I just try to show that, for instance, access to the land plays a key role, but also, for instance, whether there is a kind of commodification process or not, change a lot the entire situation. Now, having said that, you see that urban informality was also part in the recent urbanization of China. We made also some research, for instance, in Belgrade, where informality also emerges, but as a kind of characteristic of rich neighborhoods that were produced at a very, very specific moment in the regime change of Serbia. But, I mean, elements of informality you find also, we found in a study that we did on Naples, and we tried to understand why 500,000 people live in the red zone of Vesuvius, the most well-known volcano in the world, where we know what happens if that volcano explodes. And then one of the answers is, yes, it is maybe less informality, it's more about illegality, but I mean, Ananya Roy, I think, made a great paper on that question of illegality, informality, that is strongly linked. So a large part of urbanization in Italy is based on illegality, informality in some way or another. So it is not something that is restricted to the global south. It is just one element of regulation that can happen. But what we also could show is that this informality somehow disappears. In the case of Shenzhen, it disappears. In the case of Istanbul, it almost completely disappears. New Gecekondu areas are almost not constructed anymore. The existing Gecekondu areas are either demolished or regularized, and then its informality somehow is turned into formality. So it is also something that is not a characteristic as such, but that is also a phase in a transformation process. So that would be my answer. So, I mean, our starting point here was that we explicitly said we don't want to make any kind of preconcepts. So we don't divide the world into north-south or east-west or whatever. So we just look on those territories and we look what we somehow kind of find in those territories. That follows a debate, it's a hard debate about Global South, especially also in urban studies and the North. I see similar positions, for instance, Jennifer Robinson also says we should have the kind of somehow we shouldn't let influence us by these kind of preconceptions. Up to Malik Simone says the same. So even in the field of post-colonial scholars, I think we have a debate going on this question of global south and global north. But of course, I mean, popular urbanization is a process that we found in Mexico City, in Kolkata, in Lagos. So yes, I mean, you don't find that where I'm coming from in Zurich. You don't find that. No, that's clear. But of course there are certain traditions, but the point is we shouldn't somehow predefine our territories. We should let it emerge as kind of emergent categories, and then look where they appear, where those processes emerge, and so that is somehow the proposal. Now the question of how we address the planners and the architects. So I mean, I'm my own, let's say, affiliation is somehow a very hybrid affiliation. So I'm original studied geography, and I still somehow understand myself as a geographer. But already at the beginning, I studied also sociology. So for me, geography and sociology are, I mean, human geography and sociology are very closely linked. Maybe with two different perspectives that I somehow both learned from scratch. And now I'm a professor for urban sociology at the Faculty of Architecture at ETH Zurich. So I work very closely together with architects. And our neighbors are the planners. So I also work together with the planners. And I mean, I learned a lot about what does it mean to do design, no? I mean, architectural design or urban design. We have common projects. And we, but also in our research projects that I did together with quite some famous architects at ETH Studio Basel. So there we try to find ways to influence the debate and to influence kind of also the planners and the politicians. And it's, I mean, it's a long journey, but it's possible. And it means, but it means that you, I mean, also the case of Havana, that's a different project where I'm working since 2005. There I also work together with planners and architects, and there we could establish a kind of together a kind of understanding of the situation in Havana that influences now the planning process. But of course, it's always a difficult thing, because even if you convince the planners, there are still the politicians, and even if you convince the politicians or certain politicians, they might just change at the next occasion, no? And then you have totally different politicians, and they come then usually from an oppositional party and so on, and then so this is a difficult process. But I think the point here is, I mean, I'm really make a strong point on this kind of collaboration, so that we really understand. So there is a danger that we isolate ourselves. Okay, is that still sociology? Is that still cultural anthropology? Is that still in the confines of our discipline? I don't agree with that. My teams are all mixed. So in all those teams, especially in that team, there are architects, there are geographers, there are sociologists, there are cultural anthropologists. And I would say this is the strength of our work. To have these different perspectives, not as interdisciplinary perspectives, but as transdisciplinary perspectives. That means we work somehow not only together, but we work towards, let's say, with a kind of convergence. No, we try that our work converges to a kind of common language, to kind of common concepts. And with that, then it is much easier to understand the logic of architecture, the logic of planning, and to translate that into, let's say, terms and concepts, and also, I mean, our papers, how we read our papers. No, I mean, it's a different language. You have to write in a different language if you want to reach politicians, if you want to reach planners. We have to learn that. It's not something that we know. So that there is a different language, and we have to engage that. And at the end of the day, of course, it's a political project, and it needs. I mean, it's really possible only if you really, for a long time, engage in those processes. So 10 years at one place. So the idea is not that we can convince all the. I mean, this kind of research with these 8 cities is, of course, just this is kind of research. So, I mean, engagements in Switzerland, there we have quite some effects on the discourse, at least, also on the politics. And in Havana, I hope that it will also have some effect. So, but it needs a long engagement, and it has to be very together with some stakeholders, and especially, of course, also with activists. I mean, activists are key in those respects. No, that you work together with organizations from the ground that are able to kind of influence the debate and somehow influence the decisions. But I mean, that's the world. No, I mean, we can't complain. I mean, that's how the world works. No. Now the last question. Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm confronted very strongly with this question because in the Future Cities Laboratory Singapore, that exists now since 8 years, two phases. So phase number one ended 3 years ago. Now phase number two will still go on for another 2 or 3 years. And that was the goal there was really to precisely think about new technologies, smart cities, responsive cities, all these new technologies that are emerging now. Now, in that process, I somehow experienced something that is astonishing. So you focus on Singapore, and Singapore is one of the richest cities in the world. It's well organized, well planned. There's a lot of, so you can develop even more technologies. And everybody was proud about, okay, sustainability goals. We are reaching them. We are progressing in that direction. And in the future, all these wonderful possibilities and drones and all sorts of all these kind of self-organized systems and so on. Now, just cross the border in Singapore, and look. I mean, in Singapore, 5 million people, and then in the south, another 2 million, in the north, another 2 million, and look how these territories are organized. And that's a totally different world. And this is a world that is completely unsustainable and that is completely chaotic, and where all these kind of wonderful kind of technologies are not applied, or if they are applied in ways that are completely somehow against any, let's say, coordinated logic, where it could really become something that is bringing us towards, let's say, the sustainability goals and the Paris Accord and so on. So the problem is that we always look on the shop windows and on these nice shopping malls where they sell us all these wonderful things, and in the backyards get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I mean, I have traveled now many of these outskirts. We always went to the outskirts in Tokyo, in Lagos. Yesterday I was with Nitin Butler in the outskirts of Delhi, and if you look, and that's, I mean, Nitin has to tell that story, but I mean, I was really impressed to see what you call census towns, where kind of the urbanization process now really peaks is in the census towns, and that means weak regulations, that means very neoliberal structures, that means a lot of things that are completely unsustainable, that are not well planned, that are not well designed, but that will influence our future in dramatic ways. I mean, this is the production of the built environment. These are structures that will last for the next 100 years. No, even if the houses are somehow demolished after 20 years and replaced by something else, but the structure is the problem. If you understand urbanization also as something that defines further pathways of urbanization, then I can tell you this becomes very, very difficult. And I mean, we went up to Chandigarh, and the whole corridor from Delhi to Chandigarh is just one census town after the next, no? And there are some older towns in between. So that is the reality today. So you can visit it here, but I could also visit it in Switzerland. No, it's not something that is specific to India. It is specific to the world.
So just to follow up, so thank you very much. That's in fact a very interesting insight, and we should definitely take this into consideration when thinking about sustainability and technologies. Now my question was going a little bit in a different direction, in the sense that now with the advent of new technologies, the job markets maybe will be less and less related to cities as such. Because as we see cities, one of the big reasons for which cities are growing so rapidly is because of the job market. But now with the new technologies, with the possibility of working remotely, this to an extent becomes less and less true. And as I was saying, there are assessments saying that a large number of jobs that we have now may disappear in 30 to 50 years. So have you thought of how is this going to reflect on the urban fabric?
Well, it makes the urban fabric even more complex. because it does not mean that people stay in their village and suddenly the jobs come to their village. No, that's not the point. This is what I mean with this is the lesson. I mean, this is the lesson of this new urbanization process. They are somewhere, but they are not in the village. They are somewhere at the motorway because they nevertheless need a kind of relationship to other places, and that means, and that is the reason why we say mobility. We say movements. It's not migration anymore. It's movement. So people move. And then they move back, and then they move somewhere else. And that movement might be movement that are daily movements, that might be weekly movements, that might be every month. It might be half a year. You are there are some jobs, precarious jobs. You move home to your village, then you move again to a different place, to a different city, for hundreds and thousands of meters, and then again back. Maybe you move to Singapore as a kind of cheap labor. You are there for 2 years, and then you have to move again away from Singapore. Maybe you go, I don't know, to the Emirates. There you can stay maybe 2 other years. I mean, that's today the world, and that does not mean that that does mean that we construct more. So the urban fabric becomes denser. The logistical space becomes more important. And somehow, because you have to move bodies. No, it's not just, you can, at the same time, you can move ideas. But I mean, the lesson of globalization, just to give, that was already the idea. Globalization now, global communication, all these new wonderful technologies. Now we can have all sorts of video conferences and things. Now, I mean, with globalization, with kind of more intense connections through the internet, air traffic increased massively, no? Because you can still communicate with the most remote areas of this planet, but at a certain moment you want to see those people. You need to see those people, and then you travel. And that means that together with the increased density of let's say, IT connections, we have also the increased intensity of bodies. And they need I mean, airports and airplanes and boats and stuff. I mean, that is reality. So I don't see, I see it gets worse. It gets more dense and more, it's much more flexible. It becomes much more, so we have to think much more in time-space relationships. No, time becomes a crucial thing, and this kind of mobilities mean that people live for a certain time here and for a certain time there, and at the end of the day, we have much more houses and much more streets and much more roads and much more things. No. So I think that's, and whether these are kind of this kind of all these vehicles, how they finally, whether they need a driver or not, is not the key point. The bodies still move around, no? And I don't think we will develop soon a kind of telecharging kind of our bodies, no? teleporting our bodies. No, I mean that would maybe change something, but I don't think that this we will experience this kind of thing in the next several hundred years. No.
10 years.
Marie-Hélène, yes. No, first wait.
Marie-Hélène. Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure my question is very clear because I'm still trying to figure it out, but it follows on the discussion on informality somehow and about the idea of decentering and trying to bring comparison between global north and global south and to break this kind of another form of a binary in urban studies. But at the same time, I mean, you could not go into all your categories, but both the popular and the plotted, you clearly said yourself that you can't see plotted in the global north. And one of the critiques which has been made to planetary urbanization is, in a way, it could be a tool to reify again this global north versus global south. So I want to know how you try to escape this, because I wonder whether you mean plotted urbanism cannot be seen at all in the global north, or is it because, I am wondering whether it's also because you seem to focus very much in the built form and the manner in which the built form is created and produced. But for instance, there is some work right now on the manner in which the organization that manage the HLM in France and in the low-income housing are faced with a big problem, because even though the build form is the same as it was 20 years ago, the use of this build space by different population has totally shifted. So I wonder whether if you were trying to move away from what you've shown us, which is build form, and look closely at everyday lives and the manner in which space is lived, maybe it's easier to break these binaries. So I'm not sure my question is clear, but what I'm trying to say, if I want to ask you plotted urbanism in Paris, can you show it to me or not at all? And then in that case, are you able to break that binary, global north, global south, by creating a new vocabulary? If that vocabulary remains entrenched in situations which are on one side the global north and on the other side the global south.
So, as I said before, so plotted urbanization we would find in Belgrade and in Naples. I think this is in the global north, even if you say Naples is in the south. But I mean, this is European debate, but we would also find it in Milano. So the point is, yes, we find elements of that, and I mean, we developed about a dozen different categories. I could present now two. One that we especially looked at was mass housing urbanization, and there we compare Paris, of course, with Hong Kong, of course, with Istanbul and with Mexico City. I can't now go into the details here, but I mean, mass housing urbanization is of course not something that is, we say urbanization, because mass housing is one thing, social housing is another thing. So we say mass housing that is, of course, always strongly influenced and regulated by the state, but financed, and this is even true for France, by all sorts of public-private kind of constructions, and sometimes even completely privately financed. And that is something that, I mean, if you compare Hong Kong and Paris, then we start in the 1950s. And then if you look on Mexico City and on Istanbul, that starts in the 2000s. With the Toki buildings in Istanbul and with the mega conjuntos in Mexico City. And I mean, we could say that the lessons that you could learn from experiences in Hong Kong and Paris were not learned in Mexico City, and so there's very similar processes are unfolding. And in both cases, they were meant as a kind of replacement of the popular urbanization. You know? So kind of, because if you compare the role of mass housing production in Paris and Hong Kong, you see that at the same time this role, so how you house millions and millions of working class people in the boom times of the 50s, 60s, 70s, in Mexico, of course, 80s, 90s, then you see that there are, in that case, there are almost two alternative models. One was mass housing production, the other one was popular urbanization. So we can indeed compare these two processes, because they have the same role in the urbanization process, and then we can look on the everyday life. And I think popular urbanization did much better in Mexico City than the mass housing urbanization did in Paris. Much better. So this is precisely one of the goals, to make this kind of cross-boundary comparisons here, no? And to find out about what are the lessons we can learn, and what are the kind of consequences that come out of that. And in Mexico City, in the meantime, mega conjuntos, so these are huge, these are not kind of these famous towers, but these are kind of carpets of kind of single-family houses that are sometimes even produced out of styrofoam. So they after 20 years they are completely they are run down, and it's a kind of in Mexico City, it really doesn't work. Now it's seen that is something wrong with those, with that concept. But I mean, they constructed several millions of those in the outskirts, without public transport, without facilities, without centralities. So much worse than the worst experiences in Paris. No, and I know Paris pretty well. I was in all those. I mean, I studied in Paris and so on. So yes, so this is precisely what we try, and that's also a comparison across spaces and times. So here we make a comparison between the 1960s and the 2000s. No, but it needs time to develop all these different processes. But and I can assure you, we really start from. I mean, everyday life plays a key role here. So we really ask, what are the consequences for everyday? How live people under those conditions? That's a key point of the analysis. And again, planetary urbanization is a perspective, and it's a perspective of decentering. It's not a perspective that comes from the north, really not. If we are here in the south, maybe planetary urbanization is even more pressing, because it's more devastating. It's less regulated. So I think so the kind of the demolition of huge landscapes, of livelihoods in remote areas is. I mean, at the moment we analyze, for instance, planetary urbanization and extended urbanization in the Amazon region, and there you see also devastating effects where the biggest in the center of Brazil, where the biggest copper mine is now just opened. And that's a territory that is bigger. This is the biggest mine ever, and with massive effects on the environment, on the people living there, and we are reconstructing that. I mean, it's so this is the perspective, to look with a similar view on these different processes. And we are not so this research in the Amazon is done by a PhD researcher from Brazil, and he is a scholar of Luis Montemor, who already developed, also on the tracks of Henri Lefebvre, developed the concept of extended urbanization. So it's not something that just comes from the north; it also comes from the south.
Okay, thank you. We had another question.
Do we have time?
Yeah, of course we have.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay. I have a question on inequality, and my thinking is kind of coming from the work of splintering cities, and I think you're trying to get that with bypass urbanization. But what exactly is the role of having cities that are kind of on top of each other? And I'm kind of thinking of the work of A.L. Weisman, where you have cities that are segregated and are actually building in very different ways for very different people. So that's the first thing. And the second question was regards to the same thing. You keep stressing the role of resources in the extended urbanization, in the explosions. But resources also implode. And the ways that you've kind of talked about concentration today is just about humans and built form and how they move. I was wondering if you had developed a similar perspective on how the resources themselves concentrate: electricity, energy, food, gear, whatever it is, and if that was something that you developed through your different case studies. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I had two questions. The first one was at the beginning of your presentation, I sensed a bit some sort of defensiveness in talking about planetary urbanization, perhaps sort of anticipating the critiques that you have received. And, maybe I wanted you to react of what did you learn from those critiques, which ones were fair, which ones were unfair, which ones helped you change in some way. And the other question I have refers to the term popular urbanization, right? I mean, I'm very sensitive to the idea of changing, this binary between formal and informal, reassessing what informality means. But the power, why this term I think is still works, the sense of formality, informality, because it refers to very clear, or perhaps unclear, but at least terms that relate to the law, to policy, to things that one can understand. And where I'm coming at is the idea that, if popular urbanization is the act of auto-production of one's space, of one's city, of one's neighborhood, then, you know, you can go to Delhi in Scenic Farm, which is a neighborhood in the south of Delhi, which is a land that was grabbed and auto-constructed by, you know, elite interests, right? And in that sense, you know, that insurgent citizenship in certain spaces like Delhi or other places, both in the global north and global south, I mean, other examples don't come to mind, but are tools, this auto-construction, that are harnessed by two very different classes of people, right? And that's where I'm coming at, is that can you sort of preclude from this conversation that might sound boring, but of material realities of class, income, wealth, difference that don't particularly, you know, relate to questions of the built environment as clearly, right?
Difficult to keep that all together. I'll just start with that question. So for us, popular urbanization is not auto-construction. No, it's only auto-construction in the case of Mexico City. In Istanbul, it wasn't. There were complex networks, and in most of the places in India, it's also not auto-construction. Sometimes not. So that's not the defining element. The defining element here is really that it's a kind of it is related to class. So it is something that where people with low resources claim their lands and construct their own neighborhoods. It's not. I mean, that would be a different process, and it is not a massive process. No. So you find some. We could discuss about cooperatives, for instance. Other kind of forms of, let's say, where relatively affluent people also try to construct their own or somehow determine their own neighborhoods. But that would be a very specific case that we didn't look at. I mean, I have to say that, I mean, our kind of, observation was these eight urban territories, no? I mean, at a certain moment, you have just to stop. I mean, we work already since 8 years on that project. So somehow you have to stop. This is only the thing that emerges here. And then we have to debate it, and then such examples are coming up. And then we can discuss what it means. But I would say, so this kind of elite spaces, this is something else. So in our maps, the elite spaces are usually yellow and are marked as kind of elite or rich neighborhoods if they emerge. They don't always emerge, but if they emerge, and we treat that as something else, and we didn't look at it. So we didn't make, we had to stop somewhere. So we stopped, we said, okay, this elite space, we are more interested in those really huge areas, and in these areas that are more working class, middle class maybe, but not, the elite spaces were not, with some exceptions, were not our concerns. Your first question?
Critiques to planetary.
Oh, I don't start with that. You can read it. I think, there are, of course, important points. One point is a debate about the urban and the rural, and how the rural somehow reappears in many ways. There are several papers that were already published on that topic. Some more will come. I think a very interesting one is by Stefan Kipfer, will soon be published in Society and Space, about the question, is this pipeline urban, a pipeline in Alberta, in Canada, in First Nation area, and their reactions, and the reflection about the rural and the urban under those conditions. Another one is an interesting contribution by Wing-Ching Tang on Hong Kong, where he shows that the rural plays an important role in the specific high-density model of Hong Kong. I don't go into the details now, but where you see that the rural as a form or as a part of the regulation process or as even a part of the mentality can play an important role and somehow survives. But we never said that the rural doesn't survive. We just said it is not a very useful category anymore to characterize this kind of developments. Other important things, of course, the city, does the city still exist, and the city as a political concept, these are important contributions. that needs, so what is the urban? What is the right to the city? How can we claim the urban? Do we need cities? Do we need bounded areas to claim the city and so on? I don't go into that debate now, but I think these are important debates. And we hope that we can have, let's say, a richer discussion about those questions if we have a little bit more understanding of what is going on in these territories of extended urbanization. How so certain, especially the studies done by Monty-Moore, they show that also under those conditions, kind of certain cityness comes into existence. But that are, I mean, long debates. The other kind of the kind of discussions that we are not happy with here, I think, I mean, we are especially not happy on those critiques that just have a kind of give their own interpretation of planetary urbanization without reading our papers, and this is quite this is unfortunately is a phenomenon that is relatively wide, and then you have references to papers. And to other, and I mean, you have a whole cascade of references, and if you go to the beginning of that point, you'll see that they didn't read our papers. And that's a non-debate, no? And that, I would say that's my first concern. So please, I mean, if you are interested, please read our papers, and then say something about what you read there, and don't say something that is not in those papers. So, I mean, that's, I think, the most basic kind of response to it. And so, at a certain moment, we were angry about that, and now I say, okay, I will not discuss these kind of things anymore. It's up to everybody to have a kind of fair debate, to read papers, and then to give a discussion on what is really written in those papers, and not to make some assumptions and kind of misleading critiques that we never, things that we never said, just because you interpret planetary urbanization in a certain way that we never defined it. So that's, I think I stop here with that response. Yes, inequality, yes. Yes. I mean, inequality plays an important role. And I mean, there are many ways how inequality come into existence. So one is, I mean, that is something we had, again, to stop with our analysis, but we see some of our maps show a really high, let's say, I go now down, I think one of the most important, so that's Los Angeles, here we have high inequality, because we have really rich neighborhoods, they are gated, and they pop up as rich neighborhoods, no? But in Mexico City, it's even worse. You also have rich neighborhoods, and there is also a lot of so the yellow ones here, they are even in the hills and highly protected. So here we see, of course, strong inequalities. Gini coefficient in Mexico City and in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro beyond the highest. Yes. That should be a topic, and is a topic if we analyze the entire situation in these cities. Now, how that comes down in our categories. So, plotting is a form of producing inequalities. So, if you look in Istanbul, you have, let's say, the first generation, the Gioconda dwellers, that really came there and produced their houses. They are now landowners. They are pretty rich. The villagers in Shenzhen, they are really rich, and they live now in different. They live now in either. Some of them live in really kind of gated communities with kind of huge kind of a lot of water basins and nice landscapes. So they live in quite comfortable condo towers, whereas the migrant laborers still don't have the citizenship of Shenzhen or Dongguan, no? And in Dongguan, we are looking now, especially on Dongguan, they are now returning. So Dongguan has something also between 10 and 15 million inhabitants, and was for a certain time let's say the world factory. And there you have all these migrant laborers from other parts of China, and many of them are now returning because the industry is now relocating. So we are looking also on these kind of processes. So, so how this kind of new wealth somehow is generated. I could now talk about Havana, I will not. But in Havana we see a similar process where a really quite homogeneous society now becomes highly polarized because some people have houses that are placed on good locations and can offer that to tourists, and others are living in very poor locations. I mean, in very let's say precarious locations, or in peripheral locations. So there we even developed a whole concept about that. So yes, so I mean, I think this kind of polarization. So we also look on how these polarization processes are coming into existence, and just to make maybe one link to this process of just to show it how we approach that. The bypass urbanism is something, and here we start with Kolkata, is something that, where you see that at the periphery, suddenly completely new developments are coming into existence. Now that's not uncommon. Now we all know about let's say these new town developments and so on. But what happens here is more than just a new town. So in Kolkata you have, of course, the new town of Salt Lake, and then you have the current new town of Rogerhead. But then you have also this, they have the airport and airport development. Then you have this bypass, and this is what is shown here. So this yellow, these new centralities emerging in Salt Lake Sector 5 and in Rogerhead, these new malls in the south, and where you suddenly realize that there is a new city coming into existence, not as a kind of result of, let's say, a master plan. That's not the result of a master plan. That's the result of several kind of initiatives and decisions that somehow added to a situation in which suddenly you have a rich Kolkata, a modern Kolkata, but this modern Kolkata bypasses the old Kolkata that is somehow left behind. And that is almost identical processes going on in Lagos, where there is also a new town development. So Eco-Atlantic in the south, there is a new port development, a new airport project, a new toll motorway, and suddenly you have here in this yellow brownish kind of area that becomes like a completely new Lagos that leaves behind this plotted Lagos that chaotic and congested, and so this old Lagos that is somehow left behind again. So here we see suddenly very polarizing processes. We can even show it from Mexico City. It is not so, I mean, it is not so overwhelming as in the other two cities, but here again here in the western part, new centralities. This is Santa Fe and the hills around Santa Fe, again toll roads and new developments coming up that somehow bypassing, get rid of the old centralities, get rid of the old congested cities. So these kind of developments are really, really scary developments because these are large-scale developments and they are not kind of seen as that. They are not, so we don't have terms for that. So that's the reason why we said it's important to have a term, to have a concept that we can discuss it. And so here, so this is a kind of a polarization that is large-scale polarization, no? Where entire cities with millions and millions of people somehow are left behind. And I'm looking, Havana, I could show you similar kind of, the process is just starting now with capitalism coming in and processes of land grab starting, and processes of course you could here reuse also the term of the rent gap that is produced and exploited. And here I would like to refer to the new book by Shotkin that shows this process also for India and for Southeast Asia. So I think there are really, really heavy processes coming on, and on a large scale here, but plotting also is a concept that shows how it comes on the very micro scale. So how suddenly you start to exploit your neighbors, no, in quite tricky ways.
Do we have more questions? Yes, please. We have one here, and one here. Sorry, but you already had some question. We come. Okay, but maybe later. Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a small question which is in a way related to what she posed. So as you also mentioned in the beginning of your seminar that modern cities or modern urbanism, it was as a result of industrialization. So as we are today entering this post-industrialized societies or cities post-industrialism, so how do you see the future of urbanism or metropolises, megapolises, like, or do you see a very decentralized future urbanism, or no? Do you see the future urbanism in official census towns, as you mentioned, or do you predict that in the near future this dichotomy of urban and rural gets dissolved into one? Because like what's your comment on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is it on? Thank you very much, Professor. From the last 1.5 hours, I have not been able to make out what urbanization is, although I have done post-graduation in urbanization. Now, for elite urbanization, you are silent. For the influx of the people to the cities which you have mentioned, they have a very, immense importance for their geopolitical places. Like Paris, they have the highest number of tourists. Bangladesh has been a very big town for business. Even for Singapore, you're talking for absolutely cities which are the influx of the people is so rapid that the elite urbanization is there, but that gives a fall, pitfalls are there, and then there is a surrounding which are getting into some sort of resettlement, some sort of low-income group, and you are calling those things as an urbanization. I feel that that is not urbanization. That can be a semi-urbanization, but it cannot be a full urbanization. Urbanization is that when I start from my home, I have my full facilities, and when I start from my home and reach to the office, there has to be no hanky-panky. I reach very comfortably. I come back to my home, live in a peaceful manner. That is urbanization. What is your urbanization, sir?
Okay, we have a last question, please.
Hello, myself Nandita. I am an urban planner. I would like to know that how you have, like you have mentioned in the process of urbanization, you have highlighted or critically you have examined these three processes. I would like to know about gentrification. Can you throw some light that how you have addressed this, like in different city? Because I couldn't, in a one map only, I could identify you have marked a patch of gentrification. Apart from that, what was your approach in understanding or examining it, basically? On gentrification.
Okay. Goes again in all. Okay, I start with the question of what is urbanization. So, as I said at the beginning, urbanization is, in the original meaning of the term, just the extension of the built environment. No, that is the definition that was given by Ildefonso Cerdá, and he is the one that introduced the term urbanization. And so it's if you look at David Harvey's definition, it is not about I mean, that plays a role, how you come to your office in the morning and to your home in the evening. That's a key element. Lefebvre also says that. But urbanization, first of all, is this kind of extension of an urban fabric that is basically a transformation of the surface of the earth, and that is not a kind of a use in itself, but that is used. That is.
I can make one intervention here. You are saying that the job seekers coming to the town is an urbanization. Is that so? Let's get to the slot of that urbanization.
Yes, I mean if.
That means when the city is getting is a potential city and people are moving in thousands every day. In Delhi, about 5,000 to 10,000 people come to Delhi every day. Now, when they come as a job seeker, and we have no facilities for them as an urbanization city for them to accommodate, is that urbanization you are talking about?
I think a very nice to rephrase the question in terms of the area that you worked on, let's say Shenzhen. There is a certain built environment of Shenzhen, which is sort of the SEZ. It was tabula rasa. You built a special economic zone, where in some sense his definition of urbanization as moving from home to office without too much interference sort of works. And then there is the city which grew from 300,000 to 20 million or whatever it is today. And I think the question is, in what sense are the urban villages of Shenzhen urban? And in what sense do they still remain quote-unquote villages? And that is a semi-urbanization sort of notion. And in what sense does it have to be the quote-unquote the new Shenzhen that you see today? Do the villages have to become that in order to be fully sort of urban? I mean, that's the sort of question I think that you could, and how does your sort of approach of planetary urbanization sort of deal with that transformation in some sense? When the urban villages is, as you said, now being erased, Kanshia is erased and turned into something else, does it increase urbanization or decrease urbanization in some sense?
It's just, yes, that's a very good, it's a great example. I mean, because there you have, Shenzhen was an area that was really rural, and I would call that a rural area, no? Before 1980, this was a rural area with some villages and agriculture. And even the kind of the community of the village and a specific way of life. And now, what does it mean? So you need, in order to urbanize that, in a first, let's say, in this very archaic way, what do you need? You need labor, you need capital, and you need houses. No, so the labor are immigrant laborers, so they come, but they stay. Maybe not permanently, but they stay for a certain time. And what do? They work in the factory. So you need a factory building, and you need the machines, and you need the capital that to produce those. The capital came from Hong Kong and from Taiwan and later from mainland China too. And it was a kind of spillover process. So Hong Kong was the kind of place where let's say the global factory was in Hong Kong, and then it moved over to Shenzhen, and then you have to construct houses for the machines and houses for the workers, and that's the first moment of urbanization. No, here the concentration. I mean, you could make it with a very classical observation by Friedrich Engels. The concentration of means of production and labor power. That's the starting point of urbanization here. And then you need, of course, all the additional elements, and you need centralities, and you need all different things to make that running in the long run. Otherwise, it would just be a labor camp. No. And now the question of so what is? I mean, these villages, they were quite quickly. They were pretty urban if you go to these villages, and they constructed this very generic type of houses, at the beginning four floors, and then at the end 20 floors with the same layout. And then but always in the ground floor, a lot of activity, restaurants, shops, people moving. So these original forms of this urban village are very lively, and so I would call that urban, you know. And I would say that there are even urban qualities emerging there, and people that are kind of interacting with each other and meeting each other and starting to make a living there. And now the next round is somehow around that. Of course, is much more luxury. Is much more formal in that sense. Whether it is more urban is for me an open question. No.
No.
Okay.
There is a gentrification question.
Yes.
I think yes, which might end up.
Yeah, that would be. I mean, the gentrification question is very complicated, because this is really the problem of a concept that was developed in England, in London. You all know that story. Then was applied in New York with quite some success. Was applied also in, let's say, in Berlin. We applied it in Zurich. So you can apply that concept very well to many places. What then happened was that every kind of urban transformation in inner city areas, or even outside of inner city areas, were somehow labeled gentrification. And I think that is a problem. So there I would start. So I would not start with the original term of gentrification, where kind of higher income groups come in and somehow appropriate a neighborhood that is where lower income groups live. And I think this exchange, so the kind of the forced relocation of people, so the kind of basic understanding of, I mean, without relocation, no gentrification. So Tokyo has no gentrification because there is people are the owners of their territories, so no gentrification, no relocation. So if they move out, they sell it and they make a fortune. So I stick to that definition, but I wouldn't extend it to all sorts of let's say large-scale redevelopments where whole neighborhoods are kind of bulldozed. I wouldn't call that gentrification. I would call that something else, and many other examples.
You wouldn't call the transformation of the Shenzhen urban villages into...
No. I wouldn't call that... no, I definitely would call it something else. It's because it's a much more... it's a much more generalized process. We are still trying to find a term for this kind of condoization. We are not happy with the term, so we don't have it. But maybe one day we come with a proposal.
Nowadays people are relating a lot with the urban regeneration with
Yeah.
gentrification. As you have said that you won't call a redevelopment as gentrification. Do you think any relation is there between urban renewal projects and gentrification? Like,
of course there is a relation. Of course. There are similarities, but there are also differences. And I think the differences is precisely in the systematic character of that. So gentrification is something that is driven. The state plays always a role, but it is basically driven by relatively small-scale transformation processes, whereas urban renewal. I mean, this is a term that comes back. No, I mean, urban renewal was used in the 1960s in England or in Britain and in the US for this kind of complete demolition of existing structure and the complete reconstruction of those areas, and that comes back now. And that's, but that I would say, because this is a much more massive process. It's a much more it's always the question how the different actors are kind of coming together, know how they interact, what are the driving forces, what are the main effects of that. And the effect of this mass kind of destruction of neighborhoods is really, it's a different dimension. And so I would call it differently. but I had debates, of course, with people that said, yeah, but now gentrification is kind of a well-known concept, and now it's the new enemy, you know, the gentrifiers. But let's say the software developer or the artist that is drinking a cafe latte, you know, in a Starbucks, is really something else than the large-scale developers that are making billions and billions with their redevelopment schemes. No, I mean that would be my point. Just to, because if you call all of that gentrification, we are losing orientation somehow.
Any further questions?
Yeah, no, sorry, we're going. Yeah, no. No, there will be one final one. Sorry, you know, I'm very sorry, but now we are going.
Olivia,
will have to
we
answer
can
too
work
much.
with this route. You can ask your question, but I will not insist that Christian gives an answer.
I mean, even worse. Okay, now just make it quick. That's it. Okay.
You had a really good presentation.
Microphone. Thank you.
You had a really good presentation concerning to mapping, and it was very helpful. I'm an urban designer, I'm working with Intact Sheher. But I wanted to know what kind of recommendation you would like to give for such kind of urbanization patterns which we are dealing globally.
What kinds of
Recommendations for what?
For the urbanizations which we are dealing globally. Like you showed so many patterns of urbanization. So what kind of recommendation you would like? Positive part of
Yes.
such kind of things which are
Yes.
happening globally, because what we are talking currently
What will you tell
is
your planner?
yeah,
Yes.
right.
Sorry, I just give my question before this gentleman shuts me up. Yes. I want to look at the slides that you have shown of different cities, and I want to share that I was really not impressed. Even more than this, I was quite sad to see this, because you showed such different cities: Mexico City, Istanbul, Lagos, and they all look the same. So here we are, three ladies working for a program called Seher and Tak, Sustainable Cities through Heritage Revival. And we are precisely looking at how cities could harness on the unique heritage assets that they have. So my question to you is, in this process of informal urbanization, where people come from so many different places, migrants, and then eventually they end up with exactly the same design all over. So we do understand the logic behind it. Of course, people need housing and they build fast and they want to save on costs. But is there a way out of it so that we don't end up with a completely uniform world and the decays which come?
That's somehow related. So what is the recommendation? I mean, there are certain extremely strong global forces that are really difficult to cope with. No? So starting from states that are kind of imposing their strategies. I think it's not only China, but China is, of course, in the forefront of that with the One Belt, One Road. There are many others, so this is a strong force. There is a strong force through global developers that are kind of applying all their kind of generic models, whether wholesale or kind of individually, I mean, they are offered that as a kind of a package, no? I mean, yes, it's shocking. I mean, I have seen precisely this, the billboards. I mean, you always see these billboards, and they are all the same. I saw them here, the whole way up to Chandigarh. I saw these billboards, but these are the same billboards that you find in Malaysia, that you find in Indonesia. It's exactly the same. So that is shocking. You even find them in Belgrade, no? The same billboards. So it's really shocking, and that is something that is, of course, difficult to cope with. Now, what is the other side of that? And that's the small scale. So what is the small scale, and what is the specificity? And this was something that was also the reason why we wrote that book, Specificity. And I mean, these are some international architects. So, for instance, Herzog de Meuron, they are really belong some of the most famous international architects. and some also famous architects like Roger Diener or Marcel Meili, and we discussed a long time about what could be an answer. And so specificity is precisely the kind of a way of an answer to say, have a look on all these local traditions, have a look on all these local qualities, and don't think that even if all these generic models are coming, when they are coming on the ground, they're always kind of facing all sorts of very different constellations, cultures, lifestyles, traditions, and so on. So in a certain way, specificity is, first of all, an observation that each urban territory is specific and keeps, to a certain degree, that specificity. And second, it is also a kind of advice. So I openly refuse every kind of, I'm often asked about best practice. I say, I don't give you best practice. I don't believe in that. I refuse it. Best practice means you think you have recipes that you can use in all the different conditions. You know the famous Bilbao effect. Yes, construct a Guggenheim museum, and then you will have a wonderful city. No, I mean it worked somehow in Bilbao, but under very specific conditions, and it was a failure in many other places. So look on the very specific conditions and on the potentials. We call that the urban potentials that reside precisely in these local connections, in these specific differences that are evolving, and that you have to look very carefully at it. You have to look on street life, you have to look on how people meet, how people interact, what kind of local cultures are evolving and what kind of mixtures of local cultures are evolving, and to try to promote that and to support that. It's, of course, I mean, it's not very, you can't come with the kind of, the great music and say, do that. It's a very on the ground work, but that is necessary. And it's somehow to say, if you have global investors and they come with their famous flagship projects and they promise you something, so somehow resist against these tendencies. And to whom should we say that? I mean, we should say to the people, because the politicians, if we say to the politicians, because the long-term effect is the problem, not the short-term, the long-term effect, and the politician is not in power anymore if these long-term effects are coming, really showing its full dimensions. So of course it's on the people, and of course that means we have to discuss about democracy, about local democracy, about the right to the city, I mean about the right to citizenship, on the locations you are living. I mean that involves, of course, all this. Otherwise, it's not possible. But that is the only recommendation. I mean, general recommendation that I would give. So develop the specificities, and in the long run, you will have a much better. You will have a much. You will have a much better city. You will have a much better life, and you will have, at the end, also a much richer city. I mean, rich in the sense of the social richness of a city, but even the economic richness. It will be economically much more, let's say, I hate the term sustainable, but for many reasons. But it will be somehow much more robust. Let's put it this way: much more robust, because you develop something that is unique, and that's a great thing. It's a great thing to live there, and I think it will be much better living there. Okay, thank you
so much for this beautiful conclusion. I think the final word. Thank you so much for coming, and see you soon.